And so there are a number of thinkers that are influenced by Kant. There are Kantians and then neo-Kantians. But there's a particular Lutheran figure who's really important in this story, and that is Albrecht Ritschl. Now, if you're going to discuss what is Protestant liberalism in the 19th century, which, I mean, technically, I guess 1799 is the beginning, so just prior to the 19th century. But Protestant liberalism was basically a movement largely among German Protestants, and then it expanded beyond that to say we can still be Protestant Christians but also be good rationalists at the same time. We can make a kind of more rational form of Christianity that denies, say, the supernatural. And Kant gives impetus to some of these ideas in Christian liberalism, particularly that of Albrecht Ritschl. And Ritschl, he's a student of a guy named Hermann Lotze, who's a neo-Kantian, so he's kind of a next generation later guy who's drawing on Kant. And Ritschl essentially buys into the major points of Kant's system. He essentially says, he's a theologian here, not a philosopher. So Ritschl, as a theologian, says, yeah, the church is great. The Lutheran church in particular, he's saying, is necessary for society. Why is it necessary? Because it creates a moral community. Moral community is really the purpose of the church. And we don't really have access to the truths, like all that abstract stuff about, the Trinity or the pre-existence of Jesus, like all that. That's all noumena, right? That's all stuff that we don't really have any access to. So he's going to focus on what we can understand, what we can experience, particularly in terms of morality for Ritschl. Others, like Schleiermacher, does this in terms of like religious feeling and sentiment. So how does this relate to the doctrine of union with Christ? Well, Ritschl has a very influential study of Martin Luther's theology. So it's known as Ritschl's Luther study. And he devotes a significant amount of time reading and reevaluating Luther's writings. And he does this in a few different works. He's got a history of pietism that he writes, which is very critical of pietism. But then he also has this set of 2 books on the history of the doctrine of reconciliation or justification. And as he's reading Luther, he kind of reads Luther as if Luther was Kant. Like Luther, for him, brings about an understanding that God gives us his free grace as a gift, which then becomes the basis for what he says is the kingdom of God, which is the moral community of the church. And so the church can be a moral community because it's been set free from the legalism of Rome, and in freedom now the church can choose to be the moral community of good for the world. That's basically Ritschl's perspective. Now, Ritschl, when reading Luther, runs across all of these statements of Luther where Luther talks about how Jesus is present in faith, how Jesus mystically unites himself with us. He is in our hearts. There is this bond between us and Jesus, this sharing somehow in the divine nature. And Ritschl doesn't know what to do with that language, because he has already said, basically, we don't have access to God in himself, and that's all abstract stuff. So Kant reinterprets Luther. And essentially he says, when Luther talks about union with Jesus, he's not talking about something real, a real intimate union that he has within me and my soul. Instead, he says, what Luther's actually talking about is that I am united to Jesus in that my moral will becomes aligned with Jesus' moral will. You see that shift there.